So we may have a few people. You know what it's called? I'm trouble is I don't want to use this, but I'll tell you here.
One, two, one, two, one, two, one, two, one, two. All right.
So that's that. Then before that, then we've got this green fair on 2nd of September. All right, the 2nd of September, which is where we have a stall, and if any of you can come along even for an hour or two to help, that would be great. So let me know, because then I'll just say, well, there's 3 people coming in the morning, can you come in the afternoon, something like that.
By email or
Just let me, well, whichever. It's probably easiest if you send it by email, if that's all right. Whether you can come in the morning or the afternoon. So it's from 10 to 4, and I'll be there at about 9 o'clock to set it up. And Tony's not there. Tony Pugh, who is our treasurer, is away today, and he's away, but the box of books and things is actually here. And if anybody wants to buy a book, we can go and find a book for you. Or come along on the Saturday and help us there. That'd be really great. The only other talk that I'm lining up is, if you agree, is Neil Smith. Neil is a lecturer in economics in Plymouth and has been really one of our founder members, but is busy. But he quite likes talking. and he is always very interesting, isn't he?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, he's a bit of a Richard Wernerite, isn't he?
A bit, but actually he's doing his PhD and so forth. So he's into everything, I think, a bit, not just Richard.
Yeah.
But he thought he might talk about all the different currencies that are popping up and what that means. So talking about different currencies. We have had a talk on Bitcoin in the past, but I think this would be all the different ones.
I think the pound has dropped below the euro today.
What, below parity?
Oh yes.
Wow.
Ooh.
Nothing to do with Brexit.
No, of course not.
When
98% of the
when
trading
someone
on currency
speaks,
markets
if you
is
could point the
speculation.
microphone
And it's
towards
all
them.
done by algorithms.
Yeah, so it doesn't really mean anything. Sorry.
Wow. So the idea we'd have Neil in, say, November. So there'd be a talk that we can have in. We've got something. We need to think about something for October and December. So if you've got any ideas, let me know, please. Yeah. The other thing is that there's still got this idea of a community bank. We want to set up our own community bank in Devon, and there is someone who's very keen to do that, who came and talked to us a couple of months ago. And the whole idea of that is that we'll have a bank which is a charity or non-profit making and is for the local small firms and for the local people. Going back to the old days, really. I mean, it's not new, it's just something that we want to set up. So that, I was thinking, might be a September one, but I think we may have to have that on a Saturday or Sunday, because I want to invite all the positive money groups from the region, because to start with it has to be a regional bank, so it won't be big enough to be just a Devon one. And the idea is we'd invite positive money groups from Taunton, Poole, it's Dorset, Somerset, Devon, Cornwall. So if I'm speaking to Tony Greenham about that, if he's not here tonight, I'll have to contact him. But that will be now, does a Saturday or a Sunday interest any of you, or is that difficult?
That's possible.
It might be all right. 'cause I think we may want half a day or to make it worthwhile for people to come quite a distance. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. Well, I'll let you know how that transpires. So that's all the things for the future. Josh, can you just say something about what you want to do with this and whether people are happy that we do record it?
So what we're going to try and do is, if you're going to speak a while, take the microphone, pass it around, and if someone's got a comment, at least point it in their general direction because it will pick it up much better. And we'll do our best, and I'll do my best in the audio mix-up later. So quite simple. So if you're going to speak, I'll point it towards you. And yeah, so maybe raise your hand before you want to speak, and that way you know who to point it at. Apart from that, yay!
Can we go round in circles, just introduce ourselves?
All right.
Because there's some new people. Is that all right? Do you mind?
Yeah, I'm Chris Totnes.
Founder member.
I'm Sarah from Exeter.
I'm Peter from Exeter.
David, near Exeter.
Richard from Exeter.
Adrian from Exeter.
Pat from Exeter.
Michael from Heavytree.
And Cam from Axminster. Right.
And Josh from Exeter as well. I assume you're going to be presenting. Yep, here you go.
So as always with what we try and do is have something to stimulate our discussion. And last time we had a fantastic talk from Chris on positive money, called it 101, and went through what positive money are trying to do and the reasons why, and debt and so forth. So I thought this time we might, and he did it without any slides, and he did it was like nice. It was a nice change. I thought to complement that, I had been looking for some flow diagrams and how banks actually do their balance sheets. And I found it difficult to find any that I could understand. And then I came across some which had been done by someone in America. And I hope you don't mind, but it's an American person talking, as long as you don't find that difficult. And I thought they were really very good, because the one problem with, I don't know if you've read the book, what's it called? What's the positive money book called?
Modernizing money.
That one, yeah. That one's got a lot of spreadsheet sort of stuff, doesn't it? It has double entry bookkeeping in it. And I found that quite difficult to understand. And I think the way he does it is actually rather quite simple and quite nice.
Oh, sorry, Kev, we're satisfied that the American bank bookkeeping accounting conventions sort of apply here as well and more widely?
Yeah, it's surprising, in fact.
Right.
Obviously, there are slight words that are different. The Federal Reserve is not the Bank of England, but on the whole, their system is just like ours.
Right.
So I don't think you'll find that's not a problem. But what we'll do is we'll go through the first video, if that's okay. It takes about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll stop and talk about it. And then once we've finished discussion, talk about the next, have a look at the next one. Is that all right? So, but first I thought, what about having the video, the very small video from Positive Money about their three proposals? And the three proposals are: take money creation away from the banks and make it democratic, create money free of debt, and put money into the real economy rather than financial markets. So those are three things. I don't know if you've seen this video, but shall we, if you haven't, or if you've...
In one way or another, money affects almost everything that happens on the planet. If we want to deal with the big social, economic, and environmental challenges that we're facing today, changing the nature of the money we use is where we have to start. Right now, we have a problem. More than 97% of all the money in our economy is created by banks, when they make loans. Most of this money goes into house price bubbles and gambling on financial markets. This has led to ever-widening inequality, the highest personal debt in history, and house prices that very few people can afford, before even mentioning the financial crisis. But 3 simple changes to the way that money and banking works could make a huge difference. These 3 changes would give us a more stable economy, with more jobs, less personal and government debt, and a solid footing to begin tackling the environmental crisis. So, what do we need to do? Firstly, we need to take the power to create money away from the banks and return it to a democratic, accountable, and transparent process. History has shown that when banks have the power to create money, they create too much in the good times, causing financial crises, and too little in the bad times, making recession and unemployment even worse. They put most of the money that they create into house price bubbles and financial speculation, and only a small amount into businesses outside the financial sector. We simply don't think that we can trust banks, who are hardwired to chase short-term profits, with something as powerful as the ability to create money. And it's not enough to regulate them. Regulators have repeatedly failed to keep banks under control. There's no reason why they should get it right this time around. But we can't trust politicians with the keys to the printing press any more than we can trust the big banks. Instead, we need a new committee that decides whether and when to create new money. This committee would need to be accountable to Parliament and sheltered from vested interests. They would ensure the right amount of money is created, not enough to cause bubbles in a financial crisis, but not so little that it causes a recession. Secondly, we want to see money created free of debt. Right now, banks create money when they make loans, which means that for every pound in your bank account, someone else must be a pound in debt. It means that almost all the money in the economy is effectively on loan from the banks, and we have to pay interest on nearly every pound that exists. If we try to pay down our debts, money disappears from the economy, making it harder for others to repay their own debt. Instead of letting banks create our money, the state could create it, free of debt. And instead of lending money into the economy through mortgages and loans, it could be spent into the economy. This means that new debt-free money would stimulate the real economy, create jobs, and make it possible for ordinary people to start paying down their debts. Finally, we want to see money come into the real economy before it reaches financial markets and property bubbles. If newly created money was used to fund public spending or cut taxes for ordinary people, then that money would start its life in the real economy. It would create jobs and support businesses, instead of getting trapped in financial and property markets. There are real challenges facing us over the next 40 years, such as how to provide for a growing population, a changing climate, and increasingly scarce natural resources. Right now, it's impossible to solve these problems because money, which affects almost every aspect of our lives, is broken. We need to fix it and get a money system that works for society rather than against it.
Talk about that, the 3 proposals, or are you happy to move on to the first one of flow of funds? What would you like to do? Move on. Move on. Okay. So if you want to, these slides will be on the, we'll make them available. So if you want to see Wayne Vernon's, his things, that's his website.
Today we're going to be talking about the circular flow of funds. Understanding how money flows in the economy is a really great starting point for being able to understand how the macroeconomy works. What you're looking at here is kind of the typical 5-sector flow of funds model that identifies, the major demand leakages that exist. I'm not going to use this model. I think that it's an oversimplification, and I think that there's a better way to represent the flow of funds in the economy. This is the flow of funds model that I use to conceptualize the economy. It's a little bit more elaborate model than the 5-sector model, but I think once you understand where I'm coming from, this is actually a much more useful tool to understanding different policy implications, the impact of monetary policy, and things like that. The diagram breaks the flow of money into two basic directions. If you're any of these entities, government, households, or companies, and you receive a dollar, you have two basic decisions. You can spend the dollar on consumption, in which case it's spent on goods and services, it's part of aggregate demand, or you can choose to save the dollar, in which case the dollar gets pushed into financial markets for investment. And this is a really important distinction to understand because the nominal output in wages and profits and taxes from companies is not necessarily going to be equal to the nominal input they receive in aggregate demand. And aggregate demand is the market signals that tell companies how much to produce, how to price their products, how many people to hire, and so it's a really key concept to understand that when someone spends a dollar, they are adding to aggregate demand, and when someone saves a dollar, they are subtracting from aggregate demand. So once government, households, or companies save a dollar, how does it get converted back into aggregate demand? The simplest way of understanding it is that these entities borrow the money. Government will issue bonds, they'll have deficit spending, households, they'll take out mortgages or car loans, companies, they're issuing corporate bonds and other financial instruments to get money out of the financial system. But the key point to understand is that the process of each one of these entities saving and borrowing is critical to the aggregate demand, because if this process is not balanced, you're going to get nominal ups and downs in aggregate demand. Let's look at an example. So if the savings rate of each one of these entities is exactly equal to the borrowing rate of each one of these entities, then aggregate demand is essentially 100%. It's in equilibrium. However, if for whatever reason all of these entities decided to stop borrowing money, you can see how a lot of savings can get stuck into the financial system, in which case aggregate demand declines. And this is one of the reasons for the business cycle, is the expansion and contraction of credit money in the economy. A collapse in borrowing is what happened in 2007-2008. Households had purchased homes at really inflated prices, and when the value of those homes collapsed, they were sitting on upside-down balance sheets. The liability side of their balance sheet was much larger than the asset side of their balance sheet. And so what do you do when you're in trouble? Well, you stop borrowing altogether. So corporations and households stopped borrowing, and they started to deleverage their debt. They were pumping money back towards financial markets, trying to get their balance sheets whole again. And of course, this caused a drastic decline in aggregate demand. We have essentially been in a prolonged period of deleveraging ever since, and so there's been downward pressure. This is why inflation is so low. This is why it's been hard to carve out any type of economic growth, because households and corporations are still, trying to deleverage their debt. It has changed recently, but I believe that household debt to GDP is still declining, and so that puts a lot of downward pressure on prices and growth. Understanding how these demand leakages work helps us identify what is good or bad policy. For example, currently there's a lot of arguments, not just in the U.S. but across the globe, for governments to, rein in spending, to pay down debt, to do austerity. And technically, if you're in a situation where households and corporations are paying down debt and government decides to do the exact same thing and they cut off their borrowing stream, you're in a scenario where everyone's trying to deleverage and save their money at the exact same time. And this causes a drastic collapse in aggregate demand. When that collapse happens, that means, if the input declines, then the output declines. And so the nominal output in wages and profits and taxes and things decline as well. And that makes debts even harder to pay off, which encourages people to not borrow more, and you can see it's a downward spiral. Okay. This is pretty much what Keynes intuitively recognized in the Depression when he identified aggregate demand as the key nominal problem. So what was happening in the Depression, along with some blunders by the central bank, was, nobody was borrowing money and everybody was paying down debt. And this caused a drastic decline in the money supply that was circulating for aggregate demand. And so what Keynes says is, if you want to maintain this market signal, this signal that companies are receiving in aggregate demand, then you got to have public deficit spending. Because during a period of ubiquitous deleveraging, when everybody's paying down debt, government becomes the only entity, the only outlet for the savings that is building up in the financial sector. What would ideal fiscal policy look like? Well, it really depends on the actions and decisions of households and corporations, because you want the government fiscal policy to be the counterbalance to the, pro-cyclical nature of the private sector. The private sector has a tendency towards booms and busts, and you want fiscal policy to be the opposite. So, for example, if households and corporations decide to go on a spending spree, and they're borrowing a lot more money than they're saving, that means they're pumping up aggregate demand. Well, government should decrease its deficit. It should decrease the amount of money that it is asking from the financial sector, and that should both stabilize prices and stabilize growth in the economy. And the opposite is true. If you are in a recessionary spiral and households and corporations are up to their eyeballs in debt and they're trying to deleverage, well, government should borrow a ton of money to offset that, and that should maintain some kind of equilibrium in aggregate demand. If they don't do that, you're going to see rising unemployment. You're going to see a downward spiral. It gets tougher to pay off debt. Inflation collapses, and that's what we want to try to avoid. You can ask yourself, why is inflation so subdued today, even though the central bank has undergone quantitative easing and all of these different things? And the reality is that the government's deficit, this line here, has been declining every year. It's been getting smaller and smaller, yet the propensity of households and corporations to borrow is still very low. There's still a deleveraging tendency in the economy. And so this is not rocket science. If households and corporations are still wanting to deleverage their debt, and this line is going slower and slower, contributing less and less and less, well, you're going to get downward pressure in aggregate demand, downward pressure in prices, and that is the reason why inflation is so low today. This also explains why the central bank has not been able to get any traction with monetary policy, why quantitative easing doesn't cause inflation. So the primary tool that the central bank uses to determine monetary policy is something called the federal funds rate. And they manipulate this rate, this interbank rate, by inserting new reserves and liquidating treasury securities and some private assets. And what they're doing is they're manipulating the rates on these lines here. Okay, and by driving the interbank rate down to zero, they essentially drive the rates, on Treasury almost down to zero. But they're also driving the rates on mortgages down. They're driving the rates on corporate bonds down. They're basically encouraging each one of these entities to borrow money, right? So what happens if the rate has been driven all the way to zero? Essentially, you can't make borrowing any cheaper, and people still aren't borrowing. Well, at that point, it really doesn't matter how many assets the central bank liquidates. It could liquidate the entire banking system. If nobody's borrowing the cash, it's not going to end up as a signal to companies to produce more or hire more. What's good policy in this situation? Is it to pay down the debt? Is it to cut off this flow? No, that would be a really bad idea at this point, because these guys are not contributing to aggregate demand with borrowing. And so Treasury is the one to do it. Today is the cheapest time in history to borrow money for the Treasury, 0.25% on short-term bonds. And so increasing this line is the best policy at this point in history. It's not always the best policy, but right now it is. There's a couple of different ways that they can increase their deficit. One is simply increase spending, go rebuild infrastructure or public works projects, but they can also cut taxes. This is kind of the left versus right argument. You know, conservatives will say we're going to cut taxes, and that's going to increase consumer spending and consumer investment. And those on the left say no, we're going to use fiscal policy to increase spending that way. In both scenarios, the government's deficit blows up. So who is right in this scenario? Well, this is why I break households down into these different brackets: top 1%, 10%, 40%, and 50%. Because each one of these entities has a different marginal propensity to save their money. So when you give a broad-based income tax cut, it goes back to each one of these entities. The bottom 50% get very little because they pay very little in income tax. This middle 40% and top 10%, they may use it to spend it on consumption, but if it's a recessionary time, they might pinch their pennies, contribute some to savings, pay down their credit card debt. The majority of the income tax is going to go to the upper echelon, especially the top 1%. Why? Because they pay the most in income taxes. But the problem with this is that the top 1%'s marginal propensity to save is very high. And so a large part of that income tax is going to go right back into savings, back into financial markets. And so giving a broad-based tax cut is not necessarily the best way to get the money flowing towards demand. If you want to give a tax cut, giving a payroll tax cut is a great thing, because that does put money into the pockets of everyone in here. But you're trying to get money to the bottom 70% if you're trying to increase consumption or increase demand. On the other hand, government also can do fiscal policy. If they keep income taxes and payroll taxes steady and decide to rebuild our airports and highway system instead, well, that's probably a more predictable way to increase demand. The politics make this sort of thing very difficult, and I mean, honestly, if it would make it okay politically, I say give a tax cut and increase fiscal spending, make everybody happy. I mean, that would really blow out the government deficit and give a jolt to the economy. The last thing I wanted to talk about was how the foreign sector influences the domestic economy. So the foreign sector essentially has foreign savings and foreign consumption, just like we do. And our trade deficit or trade surplus is based on foreign consumption. They are consuming our products and we are consuming theirs. And so if you're running a trade surplus, that means that the foreign sector is adding dollars to your consumption markets. They're increasing your aggregate demand. If you're running a trade deficit, the opposite occurs. More dollars are leaving your consumption markets than are coming back in. The United States runs a trade deficit, which means that we are importing more goods than we are exporting to foreign markets. And so each time this cycle runs over time, we're slowly losing dollars from our consumption markets to overseas competition. Now, typically what those governments do or those companies do is buy treasury securities, so they send the money back into our domestic market through government spending. And that's kind of a key point to understand, because if you are running a net trade deficit, there needs to be a mechanism to return those dollars to consumption. We saw this big problems with Greece running a deficit and Germany running a surplus. And if Germany wasn't recirculating that surplus back into Greece, and they would have problems because they were essentially losing the amount of dollars that are circulating for their consumption slowly. So one mechanism that's really important if you are in a country that runs a trade deficit is that your government issues enough treasury securities, enough public borrowing, so that foreign entities can return those dollars to the domestic circulation. Okay, so they can buy treasuries and then return the dollars to the domestic economy. Without that, somebody has to run a deficit. It's got to be a household, a company, or government. So one of these has to run a deficit if you have a trade deficit, and I would prefer that it were Treasury running the deficit rather than households or companies. So that is my custom flow of funds model that I use to conceptualize the macro economy. It's a little different than the standard flow of funds model you may have encountered, but I believe that by breaking the flow of funds down into two behavioral directions, savings and consumption, we can better understand nominal exchange and how it impacts the real economy. Thanks for watching today. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope that this challenged your mind, or at least gives you a different perspective on how to think about the macro economy. If you have any questions or comments or controversies, I'm happy to talk to you about them. Just leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you. Thanks.
What percentage?
So can we have a sort of discussion on that?
Yeah. Yeah. So let's have a discussion. See
Okay.
what we think about it.
That seemed to me to be, as far as I can sort of know, very conventional sort of Keynesian analysis, which almost entirely ignored the role of banks in money creation and subsequently, seems to sort of include the notion of sort of household savings as being sort of significant, which is what sort of Keynes, as I recall, reckoned that one of the reasons for the Great Depression was that there was too much. Everyone was trying to save. There was sort of too much saving, and therefore, as he said, not enough was going into aggregate demand. Whereas Michael Rowbottom, for instance, claims that this was complete bollocks, that Keynes simply got that wrong, and that I'm not quite sure how Rowbottom actually reckons to know this, but certainly claimed that if you actually examined financial statistics, there was no evidence of any significant household savings at that time, and certainly the debt money analysis, the positive money analysis, would suggest that it was far more to do with the effects of banks creating money and then withdrawing money from the economy, and the effects of debt on the business cycle, coming to an aggregated crisis point in 1929 and in 2007, 2008. So I would have said that from our perspective, that has very little to say to some of the most significant factors.
I agree largely with that. I also found it difficult to understand. He talks about a government saving. Well, if government prints the money, how does it save it? It just saves it by not printing it. So I don't think you can have government saving, I would suggest. And also, there's nothing on there about tax havens, which of course means that money disappears from the economy entirely, potentially forever. But anyway, it's interesting.
He wouldn't he?
I'm sorry.
He would just say that the tax havens are all part of the financial, is that his top blob, and the money just goes into there and gets lost. He is going to talk about money creation in the next one after this. So he'll bring it in.
Okay, this doesn't appear to have taken any account of it. So anyway.
No, quite. What was the other thing you said? Oh, well, no, a government can have a surplus or a deficit.
Yeah, but it doesn't save.
Well, the equivalent of a surplus is a save.
Yeah, right. Well, I just found it odd that he talked about.
Yeah. I mean, presumably he means more tax revenue than government spending. Is that what you're sort of having? Running a surplus means.
Yeah, well, yes, exactly. But it's taking money out of the economy. But it's not. Yeah. Well, I just find it. If the government's acting for us, it's taking money out of our economy. But the government's saving. To me, it just doesn't stack up. It seems an odd way of thinking about it.
Well, it's part of the theory. The conventional theory is this is the government being prudent and holding money back for a kind of a rainy day.
Yeah, but if they
rainy day might mean.
They don't need to do that.
No,
do they?
but they put it into gold, don't they? I mean, technically speaking, it gets into reserves. The idea is that there's a reserve.
Really?
Yeah, but
austerity is.
And that's where the confidence comes from. Sorry, is in having reserves.
I don't think.
We didn't go into gold.
I don't think that's true.
I think it goes into gold.
Yeah, not anymore, but it used to.
Yeah, I'd like to know what the reserves are.
Yeah,
I've no idea.
I don't think there are any reserves.
Well, the reserves is just interbank lending. That's all it is. So the central bank creates those, and in times of crisis, they can flood them with reserves so they can.
But those are the reserve accounts of commercial banks, aren't they?
Yes.
Precisely.
So they're correlated with commercial banks' operations.
That's right. And that doesn't get into the real economy now.
So the reserves is like another form of money which doesn't actually come to us. It's
Right.
only used at the bank level.
And that's what
Yeah.
quantitative
Easing
is. So
Like the LIBOR thing. Is that?
That's
Like
different.
was the interest rate, but actually
But
the interest rate has very little correlation to demand actually from Professor Vernon.
Yeah, he's done
He's not. He's saying that actually
rubbish.
it follows exactly. Yeah. So I think that's a bit of a red herring.
I mean, for one point again, he claimed that households, for instance, have been deleveraging, trying to pay down debt since sort of 2007, 2008, and that seems utterly at variance with statistics which show that household indebtedness is at the highest point ever. The average sort of average non-mortgage household debt in the UK is now over 10,000.
But the mortgage debt is much less because the banks are refusing to give people mortgages.
But they are giving out unsecured loans like never before. So it comes back to what you're saying about the banks are actually controlling the money supply, not the government.
But overall, the money supply is still less than it was in 2007. It hasn't caught up.
Yes, because bank lending is still at a lower rate.
But you seem to be saying that, if I understood him correctly, at least the implication was that if households deleverage, you get a problem. There isn't enough money in the system.
Yes.
And the government is then required to put money into the system. But if the government, by implication, if the households go into a great deal of debt, which they have done in this country anyway, recently, that kind of, as far as he was concerned, solves the problem. And the government then don't have to put so much money into the system. That strikes me as a big flaw in that argument.
Well, he seems to be assuming, as far as I could see, he seems to be assuming, in the very sort of according to the very conventional model, that lending is recycled saving. He didn't actually state that in so many words, but it was strongly implied, which is that's what Oh, banks can only lend what they've got. All that sort of the sort of thing that people come out with when they don't get the debt money analysis. So
he's starting from the wrong point, basically. He needs to start from money creation.
Yes.
I put this one on first because I thought it set the scene. But he's going to talk about money creation in due course. So don't jump the gun too much.
But if he has any awareness of money creation, he doesn't appear to have incorporated that awareness into this and that, the analysis we've just seen.
To be balanced, he was talking about that as people take on more debt, more money gets into the economy. So he was saying that. So there was a bit of a mixed message. I agree.
But that too is that's conventional Keynesian sort of analysis as far as I know.
Right.
But when households go into debt, they don't thereby create money, do they?
They kind of presume. I think the presumption is they go into debt by spending, and therefore they're contributing to aggregate demand. That's the thing. They're going into debt in order to buy things which provide other people with wages.
Yes.
The money supply, as measured by M4, which is one way of measuring, has gone up since 1950 in a more or less a straight line. Okay, until the crisis. And it has stayed the same despite the fact of quantitative easing.
I thought it had there was a bit of a hockey stick after the Big Bang in '86.
It would have done that, except of quantitative easing. I mean, I'm talking about. But in fact, what the government should have done is put in twice as much quantitative easing to allow the economy, the money supply to carry on increasing.
But it went into the financial markets anyway, the QE, didn't it?
Well. But I mean...
But the money supply hasn't increased, isn't that exactly what we're saying?
Yeah.
Since 2007, so the quantitative easing hasn't had any effect, really.
What I'm saying is it would have gone down.
I see what you mean.
It's just stayed the same. What they should have done is even made it more.
Well, or put it into something else.
We would say it needs to go into the real economy. Yeah. Right. Anybody else want to talk about flow of funds? Right.
Well, I just sorry to be
Yeah,
slow, but just to add in that analysis, as you're saying, it's a very conventional analysis, and it completely ignores all of the work that is done for no money. And that's what lots of people are struggling with now. So as you're saying, you know, the debt burden on individual households has never been higher, but neither has the work burden been higher than it is at the moment. Lots of people are doing more than one job just to make ends meet, and still having to borrow to live at exactly the same standard of living that they had 10 years ago. And that's where it's an unsustainable system. And that's the other bit that's missing for me, is about sustainability. And I'm not good enough on commodities, but the increase in the oil price 12 years ago very likely pushed us to the point of not being able to, you know, for the bank predictions or the gambling that the banks were doing on property values to be unsustainable, because suddenly people had to pay more for oil. And that's a part of the factoring which is worth considering. Yeah, because again, it's a resource that, you know, so when we're talking about investment in infrastructure, then one of the best investments that we can make as a country without much oil is to go into renewables, because we depend upon energy and there's no way of avoiding that. So, yeah, I just
should also say that his final proposal about satisfying everybody by having tax cuts and government expenditure on infrastructure, at least some expenditure on infrastructure, it's actually quite like the Donald Trump program, which is to put huge amounts of money into infrastructure, but that is through tax breaks, not through government expenditure. So Trump combines infrastructure spending with huge tax breaks for the better off. That's his program. It's not going to happen, of course.
I'm just going to say, if only you could get it through.
Oh, we need him over here.
Gracious. What a thought.
Today we're going to examine the payment system and how banks intermediate payments between different entities. We're going to start very small with just a basic transaction, and then we'll blow it out to examine how the entire domestic payment system works with the Federal Reserve, and finally we'll examine how an international transaction is accounted for as well. Let's begin with just a quick review of balance sheets and how double entry bookkeeping works. We have three different entities here. We have Sally, the restaurant, and Wells Fargo Bank. And each of these entities has assets and liabilities. And for every liability out there, there's an asset. You know, for somebody that's holding a debt, somebody else is holding the asset to that debt. So let's examine these balance sheets to see what's going on. So Sally's holding $100 in cash. This is dollars in her pocket. She's got $1,000 in deposits. These deposits, she's a customer of Wells Fargo, these deposits are an asset of Sally and they are a liability of Wells Fargo. So here they are up in Wells Fargo Bank. Sally also has some liabilities over here. So she has a mortgage loan. So her home's worth, you know, $1,200 and she owes $1,000 mortgage loan. So this is a liability of Sally and it's an asset of Wells Fargo Bank up here. So you can see how, you know, for every liability out there, there's an asset. And so you can track the flow of money through balance sheets this way. Restaurant over here, it's got $100 in cash, $1,000 in deposits. Here are its deposits in Wells Fargo Bank up here, and we're just assuming that it has no liabilities, and so its entire cash and deposits is its equity. You know, the way I'm going to walk through these transactions might look a little strange to you if you're an accountant, because I've essentially consolidated all the individual T accounts into a single balance sheet, and I'm transacting there. But once you get used to my shorthand, it'll make a lot of sense to you, and I think you'll find it's a really easy way to follow the flow of funds. Let's walk through the simplest transaction that banks intermediate, a transaction where both of the entities are customers of the same bank. So in this transaction, Sally is going to go to the restaurant and she's going to spend $100 purchasing a meal. So let's walk through the accounting. So Sally walks up there with her debit card, and so she's going to be paying with her checking account. So her deposits are going to go down by 100. And she's a customer of Wells Fargo. So from Wells Fargo's perspective, all they need to do is decrease Sally's deposits and increase the deposits of restaurants. And then that, of course, reflects down here as payment. So that's it. That's the simplest transaction that banks intermediate. And so the bank's net position hasn't changed. The only thing that has changed is who is holding their liabilities. there is something to learn from this really simple transaction, and that's the fact that a lot of transactions in the economy are settled as bank liabilities. No government money has actually exchanged hands. No reserve deposits have exchanged hands. No cash has exchanged hands. There's a lot of confusion out there about the roles of government money and deposit money in the economy, and the fact is that a lot of the transactions in the economy are settled as bank liabilities, as deposits on banks' balance sheets. The next transaction we're going to go over is a transaction where banks intermediate between each other. In the first example, Sally went to the restaurant, no government money was exchanged. This time, Sally is going to go to a retail clothing shop over here. If you're going to be intermediating transactions between banks, that's where the Federal Reserve comes in. So let's quickly look at the Federal Reserve's balance sheet just to see what it's holding. So on its liability side, we have $1,400 notes and coins. Where are these assets at? Well, all these different entities are holding some. Wells Fargo is holding $500 in cash, Bank of America is holding $500 in cash, and each one of these entities down here is holding $100. And so all of the notes and coins out there in circulation are going to add up to this liability at the Federal Reserve. The other two liability accounts the Federal Reserve is holding is one for Wells Fargo and one for B of A, and this is the reserve system. Okay, each bank has reserve deposits, and when banks settle between each other, the Federal Reserve acts as the clearinghouse. Okay, and so just like we exchange the liabilities of bank deposits, we exchange liabilities of banks. Banks are exchanging the liabilities of the Fed. Okay, so there's a hierarchy to this money. On the asset side of the Fed's balance sheet, we see some Treasury securities, some gold, some mortgage-backed securities. There are obviously other assets they hold, but I'm just trying to keep this as simple as possible. Let's get down to business. So Sally is going to go to the retail clothing shop. Sally's a customer of Wells Fargo. The retail clothing shop is a customer of Bank of America. Let's walk through the accounting one step at a time. So Sally's deposits, let's say she's going to spend another $100. Sally's deposits are going to go down to $800. She's a customer of Wells Fargo's bank up here, so those go down. But how do they get the payment from Wells Fargo to Bank of America? Well, banks that happens on the asset side of banks' balance sheets. Banks settle payments between each other with assets. Okay, so they have some reserve deposits over here. Those are going to go down by 100. And then up here at the Federal Reserve is where they actually make the exchange between the banks. So the reserve account for Wells Fargo is going to reflect that, and then it gets transferred to Bank of America right here, and that reflects in Bank of America's reserve deposit account. And then they go ahead and credit the retail shop's deposit account over here, and that reflects down there. So that is how banks intermediate a transaction between each other. We exchange banks' liabilities. Banks are exchanging the liabilities of the Fed. So just like in the first transaction, Wells Fargo transferred deposits from Sally to the restaurant, when banks are intermediating between each other, the Fed is up here exchanging deposits between banks. So there's this hierarchy. What can we learn about this type of transaction where banks are using the Federal Reserve System to intermediate? We know that when Sally went to the restaurant, that no government money exchanged hands. It was just a switch of deposits up here in Wells Fargo Bank. When Sally goes to the retail clothing shop, we know that government money does exchange hands per se. It's the reserves up here at the Federal Reserve. But banks go to great lengths to have to avoid settling each other's debts at the Federal Reserve. The standard service that the Federal Reserve provides is something called the Fed wire service, and this is just a wire transfer service that is provided by the Fed that banks use, and it sends instructions that tells the Fed, to go ahead and debit Wells Fargo's account and credit B of A's. And so if Sally goes to the retail shop and Wells Fargo wants to do an instantaneous transaction, they'll use the Fed wire service and go ahead and send it, and then that's an instantaneous transaction. Reserves are instantly transferred. But banks go to great lengths not to have to do this, and so what most payments actually travel through is something called the Clearinghouse Interbank Payment System, CHIPS. And CHIPS is kind of like a private Federal Reserve. It's a private clearinghouse that banks use. And what CHIPS does is throughout the day it will accumulate transactions of each of these banks, and then at the end of the day they'll settle the transaction. So instead of banks doing instantaneous transactions, they accumulate transactions in the chip system, and then at the end of 24 hours the chip system will use the Fedwire service to go ahead and tell the Federal Reserve to move the accounts. Why is this significant? Well, let's say that Wells Fargo owes Bank of America $900 million at the end of the day. And let's say that Bank of America owes Wells Fargo $1 billion. Well, they don't actually need to transfer $900 million and $9 billion. The chip system can cancel these two out, and Bank of America can simply transfer $100 million to Wells Fargo. And what this enables banks to do is accumulate most of their transactions throughout the day as liabilities to the chip system. And then at the end of the day, they finally settle up here at the Federal Reserve, and very little reserves are actually changing hands. A very small amount of government money can support a massive amount of deposit money out there. The last transaction I'm going to talk about is an international transaction. And the first thing you got to learn about an international transaction is that there's actually no such thing as an international transaction. Each country has its own domestic payment system denominated in its local currency. And so when you send dollars to China or to another country, they never actually leave the United States. Dollars never leave the United States unless someone is, smuggling out physical dollars in the middle of the night. Dollars never leave the United States. And so how do international transactions work? Well, banks hold branches in all different countries. Some banks have branches in hundreds of different countries. In this example, ICBC has their branch in New York, and then they have their headquarters over here in Beijing. And each one of these branches are dealing in the domestic payment system of their individual countries. So let's walk through the flow of money in the accounting to see how this works. In this example, the retail clothing shop is going to buy some inventory from a clothing manufacturer in China. We're going to assume they're purchasing $100 in inventory. So their deposits are going to go down by 100, and they're a customer of Bank of America, so that reflects up here. And Bank of America's got to settle this with some assets, so they're going to debit that account. Up here at the Federal Reserve is where they make the transfer to the Chinese bank, so we'll go ahead and debit B of A's account and credit the reserve account at ICBC, and that reflects down here. And at the same time ICBC New York gets this reserves, they're also going to get a liability for 100. And this is an accounts payable. And all this says is that we owe the Beijing branch $100 worth of yuan, and that gets settled a little bit later. So New York will then send a SWIFT wire. SWIFT is an international wire transfer protocol. It's run by a company in Belgium, but it's kind of the international standard. So New York sends a SWIFT wire to Beijing, and Beijing's going to get an asset. They're going to calculate this at the exchange rate, and so the exchange rate fluctuates, although China has a pretty close peg to the US dollar. And so it's about 6-to-1 right now, so we're going to create an asset over here of 600 yuan, and this is an accounts receivable. And accounts receivable says we haven't received any yuan yet, but we expect to in the future. So, and they will credit the manufacturer's account for 600 yuan, and that reflects down here in his deposit account. And so that's it. That's how an international transaction works. You see no dollars left the United States. The only thing that really occurs is an accounts payable and an accounts receivable entry in the two branches of the international bank. Now, at this point, the bank can, if they really need the yuan, they can go ahead and settle out the accounts payable and accounts receivable. It really, in most cases, it really depends on what the currency is. If the U.S. dollar is rising against the yuan, they might decide to hold on to these U.S. reserves for a little bit, and they can actually, carve out a little bit of a profit there, in the exchange rate. But if they do want to go ahead, if ICBC needs that yuan right away, I think that they can go straight to the central bank over here and exchange it for yuan, or they can go into a forex market and exchange yuan with another bank, But I'm not going to get into a forex transaction in this video. One of the interesting things to examine once you understand how international transactions work is the role of the US dollar as reserve currency. And so, countries from all over the world have accounts at the Federal Reserve, and something like 85% of international transactions are settled in US dollars at the Federal Reserve. And so, in a lot of ways, the Federal Reserve is not only the central bank for the United States, it's the central bank for the entire world. It's the primary clearinghouse that countries use to settle up with one another. And so, for example, if India wanted to buy $100 worth of oil from Saudi Arabia, they would go in here and debit India's account and credit Saudi Arabia's, just like they would between two domestic banks in the domestic banking system. And so that's kind of an interesting thing to examine the role of the US dollar as a reserve, and that so many international transactions do get settled in reserves. So those are the basic transactions that banks intermediate, both domestically and internationally. I think it's really important to understand the nuts and bolts accounting of the flow of money in the system, so if you ever go to another topic, you don't get tripped up. There's just a ton of confusion out there about the role of government money and deposit credit money. Does QE cause inflation? And there's a lot of experts out there that they get tripped up. And if you have this understanding of the flow of funds, you can spot their mistakes pretty easily. But that's what I have to offer today. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. And thanks a lot.
What percentage of Congress do you think understands the relationship of debt?
Right. Does anybody want to talk about that? I'm sorry you can't see it.
It doesn't really talk about what happens when you run out of money, or you owe more money than you currently have. So, because imagine if Sally went into debt so that she could buy a meal from the restaurant or something. I don't know how important that is.
Well, that would be in the form of a loan of some kind, wouldn't it? It would have to be, whether it was credit card overdraft or a consumer loan.
Which you, okay.
Or a bankruptcy. I mean, plenty of people just go bankrupt. So they just default, that's it. They don't pay.
He's going to do, if you're interested, he's going to do how banks rate money in the next one. But it seemed important to have this one first for people that don't know how double accounting system works.
I thought it was interesting to see how the central banks fit into all that, because initially he was saying they were involved in the transaction, and I kind of, because that's not right, and then he explained the actual way it happens. But it also shows that the central banks, because they will lend if someone doesn't have enough, or if one of the banks doesn't have enough money, they will lend, and that's the interest rate that they go on about. But actually, they don't borrow from the Bank of England because of the stigma, because they're worried about being seen as insolvent. So that's why it's sort of irrelevant, really, what that interest rate is a lot of the time, because they don't actually borrow from them an awful lot. So
it seemed that this one was fairly technical and descriptive. The early one, people had objections to the conceptualization of what he was doing. But with this one, I take it you don't have objections, because he's simply describing the mechanisms and rationalization that operates between individuals and banks.
I think that is a very valid objection, that people default, and when they default, it's still absorbed, because the bit that's not in the element that's missing from the description is time and the role of time. So that one of the arguments that was given right at the beginning of our crash was, we don't have to think about this as a short-term and immediate fix. This is a successful country with people who work hard and are capable of self-regulating, so long as we spread the cost of this bust over a longer period of time. And one of the arguments that was being used was when there's been a war, we have to rebuild. This is the equivalent damage of a war. We haven't actually fought each other or killed each other or destroyed each other's property in real terms, but in imaginary terms, that's exactly what's happened. And we need to spread that cost over a very long period of time. And that never got factored in. And it doesn't fit into that model either. There's no concept of time. Every transaction that was described is an immediate rebalancing. And that's not how it works. We all know that. It just doesn't work like that. And also interest rates weren't factored in there. So interest rates do
there's
fluctuate.
loads of stuff that isn't factored in. You're absolutely right. And the fact that within its very narrow limits of what he's saying, it seems rational. It does seem rational. But indeed, once you start thinking about the way it operates in the real world, all sorts of problems emerge. All I'm saying is it's very unambitious. He's not trying to do very much.
He's just showing double entry bookkeeping
Yeah.
between banks and their customers.
Yeah.
Without the defaults.
Yeah.
But it helps understand how the defaults and how the freezing can happen when everyone just stops.
Or it jams up.
That's right.
Yeah. And confidence is lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could visualise it based on what he's describing.
Does it all work like that in this country as well?
More or less.
Mm.
We have a thing called backs rather than chips.
Is it really?
Yeah, no, our bank. That's the same. So shall we go on? Are you happy? I know it's not great. Just still to see.
Well, there's a lot of information, isn't there?
Welcome back, economics nerds. I got an interesting topic for us today. We're going to talk about endogenous money and how banks create private sector deposit money in the economy. This is a highly controversial subject. So we're going to be going through a couple of different loan transactions to see how they work, and then we're going to talk about the controversies and why economists disagree on this situation. And I think that at the end we're going to be able to draw some conclusions that some of the major economists out there don't quite see this clearly, and so it's a very interesting topic. If these balance sheets look unfamiliar to you, I highly recommend watching the payments videos, federal funds videos, treasury video to better understand how these entities are interrelated. But if you've already seen those videos or you're familiar with how the flow of funds works in balance sheets, we'll go ahead and get started. A very quick review of the hierarchy of money. This diagram shows the asset-liabilities pairs so that it demonstrates that reserves are a separate system from where our money is. So us as private entities, whether you're a company or an individual, what counts for us is the cash in our pocket, but especially the deposits we have at the bank. So for private entities, our money is represented as bank deposits, and that's a really important thing to understand. I've created a number here in the center to track the aggregate amount of deposits that are in circulation in the private sector. So this number is the sum of all of the deposit assets held by private entities down here. And so this is our money. We saw that from the hierarchy. And as we walk through these transactions, we're going to be able to track, the aggregate amount of deposits in circulation. In this example, Sally is going to be purchasing a home from the home builder, and they're both customers of Wells Fargo Bank over here. Sally doesn't have enough money to purchase the home, and so she's going to take out a loan with Wells Fargo Bank. So Sally's going to be getting a house, and let's say she purchases it for $1,000, and at the same time she's getting a mortgage liability. And that liability of Sally is an asset of Wells Fargo. And when they create that loan, at the same time, they're going to be creating $1,000 in new deposits, okay? And this is for Sally. The next thing is Sally's got to pay for her home, so we're going to go ahead and debit that account right away and go over here to the home builder and credit their account. And that reflects down here. They're getting $1,000 in deposits. They're giving up a home. So that's a simple loan transaction, okay? Sally has entered into a loan agreement with Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo has intermediated that transaction with the home builder. You can see that the total amount of deposits in circulation has increased by 1,000. Those deposits were created by Wells Fargo Bank. Let's examine some significant points. The first thing to notice is that the net position of the bank hasn't changed, okay? They have not actually made any money themselves on this transaction. All they've done is intermediated a transaction because their liabilities to the home builder went up at the same time they got the mortgage loan, although they did create $1,000 in new deposits. What's interesting about that is that banks don't make their money by creating the deposits. They make their money off of interest income. Okay, so if they're creating deposits, they're expanding their liabilities. They're expanding our money because those are our assets. Okay, so when banks expand deposits, they're expanding income for somebody in the private sector. They're expanding aggregate demand. Loans expand aggregate demand. The other key point to take away from this is that when Wells Fargo created those deposits, that was a transaction between Sally and a loan agent at Wells Fargo. Did that loan agent look at the reserve deposit balance to see if they had enough cash in the bank to cover that loan? No, he doesn't. Do they make sure that that there's enough depositors in the bank to grant that loan? No, they don't. Okay, they just write the deposits in. The only thing that really affects that decision is Sally's income, whether she's credit worthy and whether she can support that mortgage. Okay, the loan officer doesn't look in the bank's bank account to see if there was enough deposit money to grant the loan, and that's a key thing to understand because the traditional money multiplier model has it backwards. In the money multiplier model, somebody is depositing depositing cash into a bank, which is increasing, vault cash or reserve deposits. And then the bank is lending out that vault cash or reserve deposits to a borrower, and that's just not how it works. Banks are balancing their assets and their liabilities, and so a bank can expand its liabilities just like you and I can expand our liabilities anytime we want, just by entering into an agreement with somebody, okay? So they entered into an agreement with Sally, their liabilities expanded, their deposit liabilities, and there's no change in the asset side of, in the liquid asset side of their balance sheet in treasuries or in reserve deposits or vault cash. This is not to say that Wells Fargo isn't responsible for those deposits, okay? It doesn't mean that they haven't incurred any risk when they create those deposits, because if Sally defaults on this mortgage loan, then they lose this asset and they still owe that $2,000 to the home builder. If the home builder decides to go to build another home and goes to the material supplier and he wants to spend all $2,000 of this deposits, well, then Wells Fargo has to deal with Bank of America, and so there's still risk involved in creating those deposits. It's just important to understand that the moment of creation is the loan agreement, not depositing money into a bank which is then lent out. That's simply not how banks work. So why is bank theory so controversial? Why do economists disagree on how this process occurs and the significance of debt in the economy? We're going to go over two different perspectives, loanable funds and endogenous money. I'm just going to tell you up front that I have a bias towards endogenous money. I believe it more accurately describes what's actually happening. But we're going to go over loanable funds also. We're going to give them a fair shake. They are right about some things, and we're going to examine the parts that they're right about and the parts that I believe that they're missing. But let's go ahead and get started on that. There are two competing points of view out there about money and banking theory. One is called loanable funds. The other one is called endogenous money. We'll first examine loanable funds. Loanable funds believes that savings equals investment. For every dollar borrowed, there's a dollar saved. Okay, banks intermediate transactions between savers and borrowers. This is the money multiplier perspective. This is the perspective that's taught in a lot of economics departments across the country. And the general conclusion is that debt does not increase aggregate demand because it is offset by savers decreasing demand for a net zero. For every dollar borrowed, there is somebody withdrawing demand by saving a dollar. Okay, this perspective is kind of epitomized by a quote here from Paul Krugman. If I decide to cut back on my spending and stash the funds in a bank, which lends them out to someone else, this doesn't have to represent a net increase in demand. Okay, so let's examine what these loanable funds folks are talking about. Here is a scenario where the loanable funds perspective is accurate. We have an investment fund and it's looking to invest in the corporate bond market. So it's going to buy a corporate bond from this material supplier over here. So let's go through the accounting real quick. Its deposits are going to go down by 500. And it's getting a corporate bond. And up here in Bank of America, they're going to transfer the deposits from the investment fund to the supplier. And that reflects down here. And the manufacturer, the supplier has issued their corporate bond. So this is an example where, you know, one entity has deposited money in a bank and given up purchasing power, and another entity is borrowing that purchasing power, and it's intermediated by a bank. So this is kind of how loanable funds sees all savings and investment, or at least most of it. They do have, you know, liquidity preferences and things like that, of course, that augment their perspective, but this is basically how they see it, that, you know, for every dollar saved, there is a dollar invested. There are a couple of different reasons why I think the loanable funds perspective is only half of the story. One is the difference in issuing liabilities. Anybody can issue a liability out of thin air. All you have to do is enter into an agreement with somebody. The difference between the material supplier here in Bank of America is that when the material supplier issues a liability out of thin air, I can't go spend it at 7-Eleven. Okay, but when Bank of America issues a liability out of thin air, I can go spend it, or at least it represents spending power, and the bond doesn't. The bond is kind of like a term deposit or a time deposit. You know, you are freezing a certain amount of cash in order to relinquish that purchasing power to another entity. Once you understand that when banks expand their liabilities, they're increasing somebody's purchasing power without necessarily decreasing someone else's purchasing power, you can see how incomplete the loanable funds perspective is. Loanable funds essentially believes that, you know, people are saving money, and that banks are matching up those savings with some sort of investment asset, and that it's, you know, very little effect on the main economy. That you can track that, but it's not going to really affect the main flow of funds between households and companies. After looking at the nuts and bolts accounting, we know that, you know, banks are not simply a pass-through entity, that they really are a middleman, and there's lots of stuff going on in between the savings component, household savings component, and the investment component, and that in many cases, alongside of intermediating investment transactions, banks are issuing liabilities that represent purchasing power into the economy. The other thing that is really incomplete about this standard vision is that it doesn't take into account the deleveraging of debt either, paying down debt principal. And so instead of seeing the world kind of in this standard sectoral approach, I see the world a little bit differently. In my opinion, this is a more accurate way to view the flow of funds in the economy, because it takes into account that deleveraging affects the economy in the same way that savings does. Deleveraging, essentially paying down debt, destroys deposits on banks' balance sheets. We know from the accounting that, you know, the deposit liabilities of banks represents our money, and so savings withdraws spending from aggregate demand, and so does deleveraging. And so it's really the difference between the amount of savings and deleveraging versus the amount of new credit in the economy that is the offset. And you know, loanable funds folks, they think that, you know, minus a liquidity preference, that this is essentially net zero. I do not believe that. I think that the ability to create credit, the ability to expand corporate credit and treasury credit, all credit, is only constrained by banks and borrowers' willingness to make deals. Coming back to the two major theories, endogenous money has some conclusions. One is that we agree with loanable funds in some circumstances, that savings equals investments, but on top of that, banks also create deposits independent of savers. Anybody can create a liability out of thin air. We just got to enter into agreements. The difference between our liabilities and banks' liabilities is we don't use them as payment. We don't exchange them as money. And bank deposits we do. And because of this, aggregate demand includes a component of aggregate debt. Okay, so the net change in aggregate debt is going to affect aggregate demand, and this is different from a lot of mainstream thought out there. one of the questions that always comes up when you examine the creation of bank deposits is this counterfeiting? Are banks really just issuing money, financial assets that are equivalent to dollars into thin air? And yes, they are. But whether it's a corruption or whether it's a conspiracy really comes down to what is money. And I believe that there's more than one type of money. There's asset money, debt-free money, that is government money. In history, there's been times where it was gold, that there's no debt attached to it, and that can circulate. But I also believe that debt itself is a form of money, and that it's been around long before banks have. In the ancient world, you would go to your neighbor and say, hey, can I have 24 chickens, and then this fall I will come help you harvest your crop. It was this informal debt relationship, a social relationship, a social agreement. And so debt, just like money, works to facilitate exchange between two parties, and anybody can create debt, anybody can create the money. In the modern world, banks have just, hyper-articulated that reality, and they've become this middleman that can, create debts and exchanges between people at will, and they're extremely good at it. And so there's a perspective out there that, debt is one type of money, and that banks are just, helping facilitate the creation and destruction of that type of money. And I think that there's a degree of accuracy to that too. I do think that banks can get out of hand. Financial markets are something that need to be heavily regulated, and it is possible to get parasitic banking sectors that are bad, but that has just as much to do with, the population's desire to save as it does with banks' desire to create borrowing. So leave your questions in the comments. I hope that this cleared up some different things. I hope I gave you a balanced perspective on how banks create money, the goods, the bads, and the uglies.
Who is he? So was that a bit better?
Well, yes, he did. He didn't. What he didn't really consider at all in that was the relative proportions of debt money and non-debt money. I mean, if you suppose that sort of the money that banks have created was sort of 15% of the money in circulation, it statistically has some significance, but it's not preponderant. Whereas if you think it's sort of the high 90s, then it's very significant indeed. And he didn't really make sort of he kind of seemed to suggest that it wasn't a preponderant amount that predominated and sort of affected sort of every aspect of socio-economic reality.
Because if it is the preponderance of 97%, as is claimed for this country, it then becomes, the whole thing becomes very puzzling, because who are these people who believe in the other theory? They're so obviously wrong that you wonder what is going on. And maybe in the USA there is a different percentage. I don't know, but even if there isn't, there's
well, it hasn't always been 97%, has it? I mean, for instance, if you look at in Grip of Death, there's a small table which shows the results, and in 1960 or so thereabouts, it was only 80%.
So what about the USA though?
They're very much the same. Sort of most of the kind.
Remember, a lot of the 97% of the money which is created as debt is in the financial sector. We don't even see it. Right. It's probably a lot less in the household sector. And also as a proportion of cash.
But if you look at the aggregate of the way that money circulates in the economy, the effects are going to be the same, even if it's in the financial sector, are they not?
Well, the thing that seems to be completely missing for me is the fractional reserve banking, where
it doesn't exist.
Right? Well, according to that, it doesn't exist.
And it doesn't.
It doesn't. No.
The positive money analysis is that it doesn't exist, at least in the UK, and I think in the US it is slightly different, and there are some reserve requirements still.
Yes, I think that's right.
There aren't any requirements in this country now for reserve.
Not even 2%.
So my understanding is that if I borrow, say, £100,000 from the bank for a mortgage, the bank can then go and lend out another 90,000 on the basis that someone else?
No. There's actually the thing is, even insofar as there are reserve requirements, the thing is that once a deposit has been accepted and has been sort of circulated, paid out, it becomes part of the money supply. Right. So that the reserve, what is a deposit created by one bank can soon become a deposit that's paid into another bank.
Sure.
Oh, okay, fine. This is a deposit. So actually, reserves, even insofar as there is a reserve requirement, are calculated from money that some bank or other has previously created.
Sure.
In 97% of cases.
As far as I understand it, I mean, I haven't kept up with this very much, but after 2007 to 8, of course, there was a lot of government initiatives for reform, and some of them, so far as I remember, centred around fractional reserve banking in the minimal sense, that whether banks would be required to have 2% or 5% or whatever.
Well, that's capital requirements.
Yes.
Okay, that's capital requirement. There is that issue, isn't there? There is that requirement.
Yeah, but that's different. That's the bank has to have equity capital in case they have too many loans which collapse.
Okay,
that actually takes money out of the economy. In fact,
yeah.
So it's actually not very productive, and it doesn't actually prevent a crisis happening anyway. Because actually, if they go, because of they're leveraged so highly, that actually if they go down by 10%, well, actually they're bust, and the reserve requirement actually don't,
No, they don't.
Sort of not reserve. The capital requirement is something like 10.5% at the moment. They have to have capital.
Far less.
Yeah, it used to be. It used to be about 5 or 6.
Yeah.
It's going up to 10, 10.5.
That too is the outcome of sort of a long history of creating money and sort of making money on the interest, on the higher fee for the use of money. So it's sort of none of it really represents any independent stock of value, as I understand it anyway.
So my understanding of the 2007 crash was that American and also UK property, or rest of the world's property prices became inflated. People then lost trust in the way in which property was valued. So the reserves the banks had, which they thought was worth however many trillion, was actually worth significantly less trillion. So the banks were then at risk of being bankrupt. I thought that's
well, they didn't. I think they didn't want to deal with each other because it wasn't just property markets. It was all kind of the CDOs, the collateralized debt obligations, all kinds of sort of junk bonds which had been mixed up with sort of something slightly less junk in proportions that nobody knew anyway. So as long as the sort of the clearance system, the sort of interbank system worked, then they all thought, oh well, we're doing nicely out of this hunky-dory, we'll keep on lending. As soon as they weren't sure, banks weren't sure whether they could deal with each other, because they weren't sure of the other's liabilities, then they just stopped lending altogether, and that is what caused the crash. It wasn't the fact that individuals became too highly leveraged per se, sort of a class of people who couldn't afford their mortgages in the US. It was more that this was the kind of the tipping point of a system which had been going that way for a long time anyway, and banks didn't want to deal with each other. Therefore, they stopped lending, and since their lending in '97, since their lending has constantly to be recycled in order to provide the money in the economy, this was kind of like the sugar in the engine.
Right, but you're right that the initial reason for the lack of trust was that people they were defaulting on their loans. I mean that was just a tipping point, really, wasn't it? It wasn't in terms of the aggregate loans that were being defaulted on. It wasn't significant in the international system. It was more that it was just something that tipped the balance of banks being able to trust each other, because it kind of made them sort of focused attention on the fact that nobody knew what the hell was in all these sort of financial instruments that had been created.
I was like you, that I actually thought that it was adverse lending. That lending 100,000 on a house that only was the value of 100.
That was the original problem, and then they gambled on all those, and then it compounded the gamble.
Well, they mixed the really A-grade loans with the rubbish ones,
But
wrapped them up and
these,
sold them.
Repackage them.
don't these bonds then form part of their, is it reserves or capital? I don't know.
Yes.
Once they sell off these things.
Or they didn't need, that's right, they didn't
So,
need
right, which is
off-balance sheet, is what it's called.
But does it form part of their reserves or capital or not?
No.
But they just get an inflow of funds for selling junk bonds.
Yeah, I mean, it was all cross-lateral stuff.
Presumably it's all seen as an asset on the...
Their assets are the loan agreements.
Yes.
And they became worthless.
Yes.
So their assets became worthless.
So
they went, and that's why Lehman went broke.
Yes.
Conceptually central to this presentation is the distinction between asset money and debt money. And just go back to this problem I had with it, which is it's obvious that money is debt. And he said, well, debt, right for a long time in the past, has been used to create money. Indeed, in the this creation of money by private institutions has been obvious since the late 17th century. It's just obvious. So how the loan investment school, who he claims seem to deny this obvious phenomenon.
Yeah.
Who are they? What is going on?
They are.
Is it really a school of economists who can maintain this absurd?
90% of the economists believe the loanable theory.
It's Victorian times is one thing, isn't it? It's basically a Victorian era theory of economics and banking.
I have two questions. One is, as a campaigner and as somebody prepared to raise these issues, how do I explain this absurdity? And do they really believe this? And he seemed to be using Krugman's name as an example of the school, but I somehow doubt that that's really what Krugman meant.
No, he did.
He does. He had a big argument with Steve Keen.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, fair enough.
And that's why he's never really been interested in banks, because he doesn't think
I
they're
see.
important.
So it's a matter of specialisation within the economics profession, between those people who do banks and those people who do other things, is it? But the other issue is debt money, and there are some people who believe that all money is debt, right? That's what money is, it's debt. Positive money says, we want all money to be asset money, or most of it.
Debt-free.
Well, debt-free money.
You could say that money is units of account, couldn't you, without necessarily saying it's debt, and that there are units of account articulate a web of mutual obligations,
Yes,
which is a bit different to saying it's all debt to 0.001%.
Yeah, but this video was saying there are two kinds of money. Now, if that, of course, if it's true, is a very interesting thing, because money has this way of assimilating everything else to itself and becoming homogeneous and unified. But if there are two radically different kinds of money, that's an interesting conceptual advance, for me at least. And the question then is how you envisage society in which the link between debt and money, which for some people is all pervasive. I mean, David Graeber, for example, who I think inspired some of that, believes that money is debt. That's just what it is. But our organisation wants to create a world in which money are assets, not debt.
Yes.
And my desire is to have a sense of how that happens, how it changes our relationship to money, and how we bring that about. Not just in organisational changes, which can be very fragile and difficult to envisage, but just in the way that we lead our lives and conceptualise it. You know, and given that money is debt, according to some people, there will be huge barriers between changing the situation from money being debt to money being assets.
I have to say, I'm not. I mean, I've read Debt the First 5,000 Years in the Graeber's book, and I didn't take from that he thought that money is inherently debt.
He also writes for The Guardian sometimes.
And
since that book, I remember reading a paper of his, an article of his, by saying effectively he's signing up to the idea that all money is debt, though he might want to qualify that.
Well, I thought, but my understanding of what I've read his stuff in The Guardian as well, and my understanding of that was that he was basically agreeing with the positive money analysis, and he was saying almost all money is debt currently, not that money is intrinsically and forever debt, because that is its nature, but sort of that is what it has become.
Yeah. But I think it goes back to this argument of barter versus sort of debt, isn't it? It's sort of, that the two theories, sort of, the endogenous, the loanable think that it's all about barter, and that's what.
Well,
one
of the things what the economics profession does, and David Graeber is very good on this, is to say, well, what was the world like before we had money? And they imagine that it was pretty much exactly the same as it is now, except that they didn't have any money, so that it was all barter.
And that was the Adam Smith.
That was Adam Smith. It's Aristotle, it's Adam Smith, it's all economics textbook.
And Graeber really deconstructed that very clinically, didn't he? I mean, he sort of did a hatchet job on it.
It's another great failing of the division of intellectual labour that gives us the economics profession.
I thought I heard an argument somewhere that there couldn't be a lot of theories based off the idea that money came after bartering, as in you bartered first and then you got money.
Well, that's the standard theory.
But there is a counter theory that I can't explain very well, but you needed some sense of value before you could barter. I can't explain it.
It's not quite as. I mean, the issue is this: that for a long time, and it still goes on, probably 95% of economists and even sociologists, is to imagine that before money came into being, you must have had barter, because that's what we have. But they just had the same thing, but without the money. So what people do, they do this all the time, not only in this issue, is to, when they try to understand the past, they project the present onto the past without imagining they're doing it. Look at any film of the 16th century or whatever it is. So just like the present, isn't it wonderful? The past actually is very different. In the 1950s, a group of theorists associated with a man called Polanyi put forward an entirely different way of understanding the economics of the past, in which what we call economic activity is embedded in other institutions, kinship, religion, structures of reciprocity, and so on. And that is how goods are allocated. They're not allocated through barter, they're not allocated through, they might be from time to time, but not primarily through barter, not primarily through the market. The market exists on the margins. It's only from the 18th century that the market becomes the primary means of allocating goods and becomes detached from everything else. So an ancient person just wouldn't understand what we do. We didn't have the subject of economics, which is the study of how goods are allocated, separated from all other institutions and feelings, because in pre-monetary economies, your values, how you value other people, your relation to the gods, a whole range of feelings, of subjectivity, is central to the way in which the economy works. So if you give me a gift or do a service for me, in the modern world, that's meaningless unless there's a bit of paper which says it costs £5. In the ancient world, or the pre-monetary world, it's a moral obligation I have that exists within me to, in the end, do something for you in return. And that, to a large extent, is how the economy works, through values, meaning subjective moral feelings. Right?
Now, is that a debt or is that barter?
Well,
so debt and barter are both across the language which came out of the financial system. So using those to describe what happened before that is who was it Einstein that said that you can't solve any problem from the context that created it?
Yes. Sorry. But I mean, it is. What happens is that, of course, that moral obligation, which is never in traditional societies quantified, it's vulgar. It's all wrong to say, well, he did this much for me, so I go work out how much. Once it starts becoming quantified and expressed in numbers, then you're on the way to, according to Graeber, that then is in effect money. It's quantified objective obligation, whereas earlier obligations are non-quantified and subjective. That's the difference between them.
Thanks for explaining that. That helps.
Well, it's the key for understanding the past, because we live in a world in which everybody thinks the past is exactly like the present, except in a few simple-minded ways. They didn't
I would still argue that there are plenty of values which have not been quantified, that haven't been monetarised.
Absolutely.
Well, that's
That's where the burden
that's
is
Kate Railworth's donut theory as well.
Absolutely.
Unpaid work.
The value, our subjectivity
And there's
is
plenty of
there,
it.
but it's always struggling against this objective, impersonal machine.
And part of the issue is that when we start to reify, just to use a really hackneyed expression, then some of the difficulties around that unpaid work come into play, especially when you talk about morality, because if it's not paid, it has less value, when clearly our entire society would collapse if people stopped doing the things like we're all meeting here for next to no money. I mean, this is going to balance today. We're not going to have difficulty balancing today, but lots of people are struggling to balance a basic need, which is to keep a roof over their heads.
But I suppose I still think that our positive money campaign is still worth having, even though it's only dealing with a small part of our lives. It's still a corrupted part which needs sorting.
It's dealing with a locking mechanism, isn't it? The monetary system seems to be a locking mechanism which basically compels all kinds of behaviours which actually suit a very small proportion of the population and don't suit everybody else.
Right.
But as long as it continues, they are locked into our reciprocal web of interactions.
So that's why we must unlock it. Isn't that right?
The trouble I think with positive money is that they don't mention taxation,
No.
which destroys money, obviously, effectively.
Taxation destroys money. Well, taxation recycles it through government spending, doesn't it?
Well, if the government creates the money, then it taxes just to bring it back.
But how much?
It doesn't want inflation.
But doesn't it sort of recycle it from the appropriate people?
I mean, it doesn't need to. It creates it.
Yeah, but the money, wealth
You
accumulates.
don't need to. That's what's his name? The Australian economist calls corporate welfare.
Steve Keen.
No, not him. Another chap, Bill Mitchell.
But doesn't wealth sort of accumulate so that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? So without taxation,
I'm not in favour of abolishing taxation, but it's how you use it. That's to sort out the problems in society. I agree with that. To change the sort of rules of the game to some extent. But as I say, it just seems to me it's lacking in positive money, because if you're creating this money, then the taxation destroys it, and that's important in the monetary system.
I don't get what your premise about taxation destroying money. Could you go through the mechanics of it? How does taxation destroy money?
Well, effectively, because you're spending the money into the economy, and then you're bringing it back. So when you employ a nurse or something, you spend the money on whatever she gets paid, 20,000 a year, 30,000 a year. She pays tax and national insurance, so that comes back. She then spends her money to somebody else, who earns wages from it, or sells goods to her, on which VAT is payable, and so on. So more of that comes back.
But those are just recycling circuits, aren't they?
Well, effectively it is a recycling circuit, but once it comes back to the government, it disappears.
Why? Because they have to. Their public spending obligations or their public spending choices are almost always greater than the tax revenue, which is how come they sell bonds. So they're always respending.
But I agree. But look, why I think it destroys money is because otherwise you get into this business of we can't actually afford it because there isn't enough taxation. Whereas the government creates the money. We know it creates the money.
That's a different point. That's a very good point, but it's a slightly different point, isn't it?
Well, all right, yes, fair enough. I mean, but I think it's...
So which money is the government creating other than the 3% of notes and coins?
No,
and
banks create the money, but they can't do it without a banking licence, which the government sanctions.
Oh, the government,
so
the government subcontracts it.
Yeah, they're franchisees, if you like. Yeah, but as I say, I suppose my idea is that it's a way of thinking about it, because tax destroys money.
One of the problems about thinking of money as mainly asset rather than debt is that an asset is not a relation. whereas debt is a relation. For the
Yes.
debt is a particular kind of power, and one way of thinking about money is that it is power. If I have money and you don't, I have power over you. And so the debt is a form of power, which is bigger than money, but nevertheless debt is a form of power. If you imagine all money being asset money, then you've broken that. Money doesn't imply a relation, but there's a sense in which money has to imply a relation. You couldn't, for example, have everybody as a multimillionaire, because nobody would then have power over anybody else and require them to do things, like make things or wash your car or whatever it is.
Well, it would kind of just be hyperinflation. Everyone's a multi-millionaire, therefore sort of the people would still need things, but they'd just be, the price of everything would be a great deal higher.
Indeed. So in the end, you get the re-establishment of a power relations through money. But power relation through money is in effect debt. That's why I'm thinking that debt is somehow central to money. Because money is power, the kind of power that money embodies is debt. And how do you shake off debt from money? Is it logically impossible?
Well, again, can you not simply regard money as a unit, or a sort of a unit of money as a unit of account? Money is a way of accounting inputs and outputs in a network of social relationships.
It's a token of exchange, which is what that was illustrating very adequately. And I still feel like I'm coming back to the same thing, is that you're trying to put a price on everything, and there are lots of things that are priceless. You can't quantify them, and we don't quantify them. But we have a culture that is reducing us to attempting to quantify things. So then people end up feeling like the thing that you're describing, which it sounds to me, which is to say that I have no money and therefore I'm powerless. And actually that's ridiculous, and it's not true.
No, I'm not saying that. Of course, if you don't have money, it doesn't mean you're powerless. What I'm saying that we're talking about money, and you can imagine society without any money. Okay, that would be fine. That would be great. If it worked, it'd be terrific. Fine. It's the anarchist dream of society in which no people have power over everybody else. And of course, there's masses of activity that goes on in our society that has nothing to do with money. But if you are talk about money, which is what we do, called positive money, then you have to think about how it actually works and what exactly it is. And my conceptual issue is how money can be an asset rather than... Money is essentially a relation. It's a question of whether you regard something as essentially a thing or a relation. And for me, money is... And this applies to all sorts of issues, but for me, money is essentially a relation. And then the question arises of what sort of relation it is. It's a relation of power. You can call it a unit of account, because money is one of those things that is actually many different things at once.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's confidence, it's power, it's debt, it's a unity of account. But then the question arises, if you get rid of any of those things, does it cease to be money? Are they all central to it? And the power relation in money seems to me to be central to it, isn't it? I mean, I haven't properly thought this through, but that makes it difficult to conceptually to understand how all money can be an asset, where in fact you might say that all money has to be a power relation, that is to say a debt. Now, of course, I agree with you. This is only if you're going to talk about money, and there are plenty of other things much more important.
Well, the confidence thing is, the confidence component is collective confidence, isn't it? That if, as long as there is collective confidence in a system, in a monetary system, a system of mutual accounting, and people are prepared to act in terms of it consistently, then it'll work. So that's the confidence. And say a government guarantee, if one chooses the sovereign money path, is a way of ensuring that, or at least a way of sort of having a fairly good chance of ensuring it. So I mean the power, certainly. I mean it's power to money is sort of like power to buy. But when one talks again, if one sort of thinks of units of account, then it is simply describing those kind of relationships, mutual power to engage in a coherent set of exchanges.
Yeah, but the point is that the power relation is not independent of the money. In a monetized society, the power relationship is embodied in the money. The money is what creates the power.
But it's reciprocal power. I mean, I'm not sure whether sort of the power here is anything different from simply people acting in a coherent network and recognising a consistent set of of obligations and prerogatives, and money mediates that as units of account.
You could have a society in which people are using money and doing so in a relatively anarchist way without creating a series of distorting power relationships between them. But nevertheless, it seems to me that if you do have money as pervasive as you do in our society, they're not all societies, it's the point of it is indeed to be a vehicle of interpersonal power, right? I can't see to be sure, in order to do that, it has to be a unit of account. That is to say, its unit of accountness is essential to its operating as a power relation.
Here's a scenario then. This is the bit I'm trying to fit your model to. People towards the end of their lives tend to have more money than those who start out. Some people inherit some, but they're in a smaller minority. Most people towards the end of their lives have established themselves materially, and money is a very good token for the exchange of material wealth rather than any other kind of wealth. So why is it then that at the end of their lives, in an ageing demographic as we have, the one thing that those people need, they cannot buy if money is power in the way that you describe it? And the thing that they need is care, but the thing that they cannot buy is care.
Well, there are plenty of things money cannot buy love, we are told. Love is more important for some people than things. When I say power, I don't mean power to buy absolutely everything, but it doesn't mean money isn't power. Money is power that allows you to get other people to do things. You can't get money to get people to love you. But what I'm asking is, can you describe the way in which the I'm not sure what the word is for it, but what you're investing money with, the meaning that you are giving money, how that applies to that scenario? How does it apply in that scenario? I would say it probably doesn't apply to it at all.
At all.
And if it did, you could find other scenarios which it certainly doesn't apply to. So there's masses of scenarios in which, as we know, and Aristotle was the first person to point out, money is absolutely useless. Of course. And you might be dying of starvation, and not being another £1 million in the bank, but because you're in the middle of a jungle, also you can't use it. So
again, I mean, money is it's the power to sort of to buy within that system, but it's the power that it actually represents, essentially any different from simply the power that you could say people need each other in various ways, and if somebody needs you, that is a kind of power, but it's reciprocal, because you might need them in much the same way or in different ways. So it's simply sort of interpenetrating reciprocal power relations, and sort of unit of account, reciprocal power relations. They're all sort of fairly sort of correlatable functions.
Yes, but I'm not hearing anything to dissuade me from the view that money embodies interpersonal power.
Well, okay, but reciprocal is
this is great. I'm not going to stop you. But would the last person put out the and see you next time? Lovely chat. Some of us have got trains to catch.
If anyone's interested, I will put this on YouTube. The audio should be much better than last time, so you can continue the conversation or review as necessary. Did you enjoy it?
Yes, it was. Yeah, it's. I've got some reading to do.